Good evening. Thank you all for joining us tonight for this joint program of the Hatfield Historical Society and the Whately Historical Society. If you are associated with one of those, would you please raise your hand? Yay! Thank you so much. Okay. Thank you, Derica, for saying you can't hear me. I will speak up. Do you want to come? Yeah, this is a good time to move around if you need to move around to hear the speaker, because this is where the speaker is going to be. Thank you. Wonderful. All right. I'm Meg Baker, and I am the curator of the Hatfield Historical Society's Historical Museum. And I am very grateful to have you all here tonight for our first program of 2024. It has a bit of a history on its own. I'll keep it brief. In 2021, years ago, we had a grant that my predecessor and mentor and friend, Kathy Gow, put together to have a lot of different artifacts, different documents transcribed. And we had a wonderful program to invite people to transcribe these documents. One of those people is our speaker tonight, Susan Maciorowski, who did wonderful work transcribing the indenture records, but also Reuben Wells' boyhood diary and some, I believe, was it Civil War or Revolutionary War? Civil War letters, Daniel Wells' Civil War diary. So a great deal of experience. And one of the things that I really enjoyed about Susan's work is that it wasn't just what the words were on the page, it was what the story was behind those words. Every time I'd receive an update or there'd be a new file in the Google Drive, it would have more story, more bits and pieces that went deeper into what these documents meant. So, when we came up to this batch of transcriptions, to transcribe the available indenture records of children who were indentured in Hatfield in the 17 and 1800s. I knew it was going to be wonderful, and I am not in the slightest disappointed, and I am very thrilled that she has agreed to come and share this in person with all of you. What more can I say? I really appreciate all your work, and please would you give her a round of applause to welcome her.
Well, thank you, Meg, and thank you all for coming. I want to set expectations low. I haven't given a presentation like this in years. I haven't talked for a lengthy period in ages, so if my voice goes or my mind goes, I apologize in advance. So, as Meg said, this is based on research that was done associated with several children who were indentured to Hatfield residents between the years 1744 and 1847. This research was based on the actual indentured documents, 11 of which were newly transcribed as Meg described. One also existed and is available on the Pecumtuck Valley Memorial Association, and we've included that in tonight's presentation. In short, these indenture documents fall into two categories. Craft indentures, where basically a child's parent binds out their child to another individual, and in this case, their Hatfield residents. The others are paupership indentures, and that's between the overseers of the poor and a Hatfield resident. We have two that fit into the craft category, and they represent sort of the outer edges of the time frame. The 1744 one is with a Northfield resident and a Hatfield resident, and the 1847 is between two Hatfield residents, and that is the first one done under the Oliver Smith will. All of the others are paupership indentures, And 9 of those are with the Boston Overseers of the Poor, and 1 is with the Hatfield Overseers of the Poor. So I thought I'd give you a little bit of background in that about the Overseers of the Poor and the actual indenture agreements. The position of Overseers of the Poor was established in the England Poor Laws at the turn of the 17th century, so they date back to Elizabethan times. And that same position was retained in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So the Overseers of the Poor were tasked to administer to the poor of the community. And that could include collecting taxes, giving out food or clothing, but also importantly, operating the almshouses and the workhouses. Now in the 17th and 18th century, the Overseers of the Poor were comprised of really the prominent, the eminent, and the rich and powerful of the community. And in a city like Boston, that would be often elected or appointed officials. But in a town like Hatfield or Whately or any of the towns along the Connecticut River Valley, that was the Board of Selectmen who filled that role of Overseers of the Poor. And I just want to show you how frugal the Hatfield Overseers of the Poor were. They used the same stationery for the Board of Selectmen and the Overseers of the Poor, and they did this even into the 20th century. So the way it was, if a poor person came into town, they could apply to the Overseers of the Poor for assistance. But if you hadn't lived in the town for 5 years, the overseers would sue that person's hometown to be reimbursed. And in the 1861 annual report for the town, there's a long story of this Phoebe Partridge who came to town from Rutland, Vermont. And the townspeople were really upset. She was causing the town to pay $2.50 a week for her upkeep, and the bill was now $100. So they said, do something. And so the Overseers of the Poor did research, and they, believe it or not, they went back 100 years to the 1750s and found her great-grandfather lived in Barry. So they sued the town of Barry. Barry paid the bill. Try that today. Try that today. But the overseers weren't there just to receive applications. They had to actively go out into the community and assess the needs. And they could unilaterally decide who went into the workhouse or the almshouse. They could unilaterally decide, with or without parental consent, to remove a child from the home for that child's well-being and safety. And they could also unilaterally decide, with or without parental consent, to bind out that child as an indentured servant. Their thinking was they were doing good for that child. They would be putting that child into a home with a husband and a wife who would feed that child, clothe that child, educate that child, and teach that child a trade, so that by the time they were an adult, they would be a productive member of the community. But there was also sort of a side benefit. If I bind out that child, I'm no longer responsible for their financial upkeep within the town. Someone else is responsible. And then there was another sort of very subtle benefit. It maintained the status quo of the upper echelons and the lower echelons. I'm continuing to have the people who will service me with their trades and their housekeeping skills or whatever it might be. Now, when they did bind out a child, there was an actual contract. And shown here is one from Boston. They had so many that they actually had printed forms with a fill in the blank. And they referred to the person who was going to become the overseer, who was taking on that child as master. He was the master. And if you were the master from a different town, say if you were from Hatfield, and you were taking a child from Boston, you needed a recommendation from your Board of Selectmen. And it's interesting wording that was in the recommendation. It says, "Man of sober life and conversation, and in such circumstances that we can recommend him as a fit person to bind an apprentice to." I stepped back and I said, I don't know what sober conversation meant in the 18th century. But then again, I don't know what it means today either. So in the contract, the master had to house, clothe, and feed the servant. They also had to take care of the child whenever they got sick. As I mentioned earlier, they had to teach them a skill. For girls, it was relatively limited. It was housekeeping, knitting, sewing, spinning. For boys, there was a much broader range. It could be blacksmithing, it could be husbandry, it could be shoemaking. There were some that were even bound out for the seafaring industry. One important thing to note, though, is that they also had to educate the child. That was something new that was introduced in Massachusetts. It was not part of the England Poor Laws. And it became so, it spread out to other parts of the colonies based on what Massachusetts was doing. There was sort of a butt to it a little bit. The boys were taught reading, writing, and what was called cipher, which today is mathematics. Girls were only taught reading and writing. But eventually, they were taught mathematics as well. There was a key part to the indenture, too, which said, at the end, if the child was still living, they got 2 sets of clothing, one for Sabbath and one for weekday. Now, in this time period, a set of clothing would have been equal to about 4 to 5 months' worth of wages. The other piece is that males, and only males, received a freedom payment, which could vary from roughly £100 or $100, depending on the time period we're discussing. Girls got no payment of that kind. Now, the other aspect of the contract was what was required of the servant. And again, I stepped back and I looked at this and I thought, some of these children couldn't read yet, so they had no idea what this contract was saying, but yet they were obligated to abide by it. And then the other aspect, as I looked at it, I felt this is like the 10 commandments of being an indentured servant. You have to honor your master and mistress. You can't speak ill of them. You need to protect their property. And then there are a lot of things you can't do. You can't go to the inn, you can't play cards, you can't game, you can't do this, you can't do that. And then you cannot leave that service. You have to fulfill the service until you reach the age of 18 for girls and 21 for boys. And in some instances, children were bound out at the age of 2. Now, one other key thing is that it says that you could not enter into a marriage contract. So think about those young girls. They didn't get any money at the end of their service period. They couldn't have engaged in a marriage contract. So many of them basically became servants within that family for the rest of their lives unless they were fortunate enough to marry later on. So some servants did run away. I didn't find any that Hatfield were apprenticed to that ran away, but there are 2 here from Sunderland and 1 from Hadley that ran away. And some did run away because they were treated poorly, but some of the boys ran away because they felt they could start their own business sooner and not be bound to that one master. Some of these advertisements for the return are quite interesting. The one from Hadley says, in part, after describing the age and the clothes they're wearing, that it says that he is, clumsy in motion, shouts about his diet, and sings loudly in the Roman Catholic style. I have no idea what that could mean in the 18th century. I mean, it's certainly not Latin or Gregorian chant, so what did it mean? But you as an individual, if you came across that child who was running away, were bound to return them according to the law. Yes?
It said 1 cent reward. That's what the reward was for bringing back the servant?
That is correct. 1 cent if you return the child.
That almost makes it worth it.
It makes it worth it, yeah. Now, for the Boston indentured servant children, they came, many of them, from the almshouse, which in this time period was located on the edge of the Boston Common. And reading about the almshouse in this time period, it was falling apart, and it would fit exactly a description of a Charles Dickens novel. It was not a good place to be. In fact, a lot of the upper crust wanted it moved because it was spoiling their fancy houses that were being built on Beacon Hill. But imagine this stranger comes to the almshouse that you've never met, and he just takes you away from the town that you have known all your life, brief that it may have been, and takes you out to Hatfield and these towns along the Connecticut River Valley. What do you think those children thought? The stranger taking me through the wilderness on a journey that probably took several days. Was it terrifying, or was it an adventure for some of them? It's hard to say. I know what category I probably would have been in, not an adventure one. What happened during the period 1734 to 1776 is that Boston Overseers of the Poor bound out 700 children. What I found amazing, looking at our local area, that Hatfield was ranked number 3 in terms of those who were bound out. We were only behind Westfield and Springfield in terms of numbers. I really thought that Northampton would have had more, but no, Hatfield was ranked number 3 for this area. So these are the 8 children who were bound out from Boston to Hatfield. Mary Nichols was the first one in 1760. And I've been able to trace that she and her young sister, Rebecca, who was only 3 at the time, entered the almshouse in 1759. And her young sister, Rebecca, died a few weeks later. So for about 9 months to a year, Mary Nichols was in the almshouse all by herself with no other family members. It was at that time then that Dr. Perez Marsh became her master. At the other end of the spectrum, there's Margaret Hearn in 1774, and she spent 3 years of her life in the almshouse before Josiah Alice finally took her on. They tended to be there several months to as much as 3 years in the set that I looked at. If you look at the people who became their masters, they do represent the prominent, the eminent, the rich of the towns. In fact, several of them are related to the person who is considered the richest person in town, Colonel Israel Williams. Dr. Perez Marsh is his son-in-law. His daughter, Sarah Williams, was married to Perez. Then William Williams and Israel Williams' children were her children. All of the others are descendants of the original founders of Hatfield. When I saw this list, there were a couple of things that set off alarm bells to me because I'm looking at it from this century. William Williams and Israel Williams were both bachelors when they took on these children. And in this day and age, it just sets off alarm bells, and I needed to step back in time and try and remember that they probably still lived with their father, and there was a whole family setting in which these children were then bound. On the other hand, it seemed to contradict what the overseers were writing over and over again, that these children needed to be placed in a household with a husband and wife. So why were they different? I could not find out. As you can see, all of the girls were basically taught the skills of knitting, sewing, spinning, and housewifery. Two of the boys were taught husbandry. Thomas Banks, whom I'll go into a bit later, first shows no identification, and that was done several times because the master could decide, once I get him to the community, what's the best trade that he should be taught. So that's why you'll see that sometimes. In general, these children are, 6 to 7 years of age. They're not the 2-year-olds. That also meant that I only have to school them for maybe about 4 years, and then they can start working almost full-time for me. This is the one between the Hatfield overseers of the poor. And they bound out John Wheeler Jr. to Rodolphus Morton, yet again another prominent member of the community. In 1836, Rodolphus was a town clerk. He was also an engineer, and I think in your archives you have a plot of the town that he had drafted with an associate. What's interesting about this particular one is that the overseers say that they removed John from the home of his father, John Wheeler, a poor person residing in Hatfield. And we certainly know that he was a poor person. This is a picture from the Daniel Wells history book showing the cabins on Elm Street where the African Americans lived. And that's where, this is the type of cabin, if not the cabin, where John Wheeler's family resided, or his descendants. The African American community on Elm Street was roughly about 106 Elm Street to 116 Elm Street today. And in looking through the history of the Wheeler family, there could be about 12 individuals living in this cabin. The reason they gave for the removal is very clear. It says the overseers determined that the parents are unable to maintain the child. There were several things I found interesting and disturbing about this particular indenture. The first one is that they refer to John as a colored boy. All the others refer to the child either as a minor child or a poor child. Granted, he was of African American descent, but why not just say poor child like all the others in indentures that have been done? The other thing was that there was no parental sign-off, even though John Wheeler, the father, was still living in town. He could at least have put his X mark there to show his approval, but there was no sign-off. I was also surprised about John Wheeler's age. He was 17. I thought, isn't that old enough to just be hired out as a hand? Why is he being bound out? Why couldn't, or if he was in need, why didn't they do it sooner? And then the last thing is that I couldn't find any other records in town about John Wheeler Jr., the indentured child, other than this indentured record. And that, again, was a bit disturbing because I could find a lot about his father. John Wheeler, the father, first appears in our records in 1813 as Jacob Wheeler marrying Demis Remington in Hatfield. And then as you go through the different records, his name becomes Jacob Wheeler, Jack Wheeler, John Wheeler. It just evolved, so we can trace him. And John and Demis had 4 children, 2 daughters, 2 sons. The sons that I can find are named Selah and Hosea. There is no John. So it's a bit sad, maybe the town fathers renamed Sela to John. That's the only thing I can guess. But I could not find him. But I could also say that the town did well by the family because they did take care of this child. And I also found that John Wheeler, the father, was an escaped slave. And Hatfield never returned him under the Fugitive Slavery Acts of either 1793 or 1850. And that as he got older, John Wheeler, the father, needed care, and the overseers of the poor took care of him. So the first one that I'm going to talk about, that's the craft apprentice, is the oldest one. It's 1744, and it's between Michael Gilson and John Belding of Hatfield, and the child is Zechariah. Michael Gilson was originally from Groton, Massachusetts, and that's where Zechariah was born. But then he moved to an area about 20 miles north of Northfield, Massachusetts, which over time became known as Westmoreland, New Hampshire. And this contract had almost the same wording in terms of the do's and the don'ts that the servant had to abide by. But what was interesting was that there was no requirement to teach him to read or write. And at the end of the apprenticeship, he got a Bible. This is the only one that required a Bible. So I assumed he must be able to read, otherwise what's the point of the Bible? And then it did offer him some funds, which read 10 pounds in bills of public credits of ye old tenor at their present value. I've read that over and over and I can't figure it out. So does that mean if I have $10 and in 20 years it's worth 15, do I still just get $10 or do I get the 15? I don't think they were doing net present value the way we do it in the 21st century. And then the last one we have is the first one done over the Oliver Smith will. And there are major differences between this and all the others. It is truly transformational. It's a contract between Joseph Billings and Otis's father, Elisha Wells. And all Elisha had to do was guarantee that his son would behave honestly. And then Joseph was just charged with cultivating habits of husbandry, temperance, and virtue, and provide further education only if deemed necessary. And also, Joseph was not referred to as master. What's interesting, too, is the contract signatories. You'll see Austin Smith as the executor of the Oliver Smith will, as well as Elisha Wells, the father. But you also see that Otis Wells himself had to sign on that this is what he was going to be doing. Joseph Billings obviously signed it, and for the first time I saw a woman's signature. And I thought, oh, this is Joseph's wife. Nope, it's Joseph's sister. And why she was chosen as a witness rather than the wife, I have no idea. The other key thing is that this contract was only for 9 months, and at the end, Otis would receive $80. Now think about 12 years earlier, John Wheeler was bound for 4 years. He was going to get $100. So it's like $25 a year. Now, Otis, if we extrapolate out, would be getting almost $100 a year. So the town of Hatfield should be very proud of what Oliver Smith has done to really transform the indentured servitude going forward. So now you ask, what happened to all of these children? Well, Otis Wells is very easy to trace. He was born in town, the son of Elisha and Louisa Wells. He was actually the brother of Daniel Wells, the author of the History of Hatfield in 3 parts. He remained in Hatfield and became a farmer, and according to the Wells history book, he was also one of the larger broom manufacturers. He didn't need to be taught to read or write because prior to his indenture, he had graduated from Williston Academy. In 1851, he married Celia Loomis of Whately, and they had 2 children. And while he registered for the Civil War draft, he was never called up. But sadly, he died at the age of 57 from a drowning, and he's basically buried right behind us in the Main Street Cemetery. The next person, and I apologize that this slide is so busy, but there's actually a lot to tell about Zechariah Gilson. Zechariah became a soldier in the French and Indian War before the completion of his indenture period in 1757. He was commanded by Israel Williams, who was a captain only at that time, to do garrison duty in Northampton. And then in 1757, he was part of Captain Burke's company that was deployed to help defend Fort William Henry. What's really interesting is to go through the muster roll for Captain Burke's company. And if you go down the muster roll, you'll see a Jonathan Belding, not John Belding, Jonathan Belding, as a private in the company. And then you go further down the list and you see Zechariah Gilson. And next to his name it says, servant to Jonathan Belding. So what happened there? And one questions, did Zechariah willingly go, or was he forced to go because he was the servant of Jonathan Belding? That's a question we can never answer. What happened at Fort William Henry was the inspiration in part for James Fenimore Cooper's book, The Last of the Mohicans. The British were defeated and they surrendered the fort. Because of how valiantly they fought, the French allowed them an honorable capitulation, which meant the soldiers and all the civilians, men, women, and children, could take all their possessions as they left the fort. And the soldiers could even take their guns and 1 cannon. Sadly, the Indians who were fighting with the British did not recognize this agreement. And they ambushed the British as they were leaving the fort, and many women and children and men were killed. Others were taken captive into Canada. And Zechariah was one of those who was taken captive into Canada. And he wasn't released until 1758 as part of a prisoner exchange program with the French. In 1759, Zechariah petitioned the governor of Massachusetts to be reimbursed for or compensated for his sufferings in Canada. And the Massachusetts archives actually have his letter in the archives. It's a 2-page letter. And I thought I would read part of it that I've highlighted so you can hear in Zechariah's own thoughts and words what happened. It says, Zechariah Gilson of Hatfield in the county of Hampshire was one of those unhappy sufferers at the capitulation by the hands of a savage, bloodthirsty, and barbarously cruel enemy, being stripped by the Indians and after other abuses by them, carried as a captive prisoner to Montreal in Canada, where your petitioner was by the kindness of Providence and interposition of the French redeemed from a slavery worse than Egyptian and mostly to be dreaded. And by the way of Halifax, where your petitioner was taken down with the smallpox without money or friends for his relief, and then was eventually returned to this country. So in 1758, you may ask what happened to Jonathan Belding, his second master, if you will, who was also on the fort in the company of Captain Burke, he also was taken captive. He was taken captive to Quebec. And then many of those prisoners were transported to France. And he actually died in France on or before February of 1758. So Zechariah is back in Hatfield, and his second master is dead. It turns out that John Belding, who was his first original indentured master, had died in March of 1758. Did he ever get his freedom payment? We'll never know. One would have thought, too, I should add, he did get £5 from Governor Pownell for his sufferings in captivity. I should have mentioned that. So one would think, I would say, enough fighting, I'm done. But apparently in 1760, under the command of Captain Elijah Smith, he was part of the contingent from Northampton that was on the Crown Point expedition against Canada. And what's interesting in that muster roll is it shows Zechariah not living in Hatfield, but now in Northampton. The Crown Point expedition was part of a three-pronged attack that General Amherst was leading against Crown Point, Ticonderoga, and Quebec. Fortunately, the French yielded the Crown Point fort, and Zechariah returned safely back, not having been held captive a second time. After coming back to this area, Zechariah moved to Westmoreland, New Hampshire, and then eventually to Westminster, Vermont, where his brother and widowed mother lived. He married and fathered 10 children, so he was busy. He did serve in the Revolutionary War, but only for about 3 months as a lieutenant for some Vermont troops that actually were sent to aid the New York troops in the Revolutionary War. He died in 1804 and is buried in the Gilson Cemetery in Westminster, Vermont, which is actually on land that his farm was. He left quite an extensive estate, I should mention too. There's a whole probate will that goes on listing, I own this, I own that. So we know what happened to the 1847. We know what happened to the 744 indentured servants. But for all these children, 7 of them could find no record of what happened to them. No matter how hard I tried, I could not find anything. I talked about John Wheeler, Jr. In the 1840 census for Rodolphus Morton, it lists, and these are the words that are in the census, 1 free colored person, ages 16 to 24. So that could have been John Wheeler, but they don't list names in the census for all household members until 1850. For Mary Lisco, in the town records, there is a Mary Lisco that could be her, who is listed as a single mother, giving birth to Eleazar Church in 1784. This could be her, but I couldn't find any corroborating evidence, and no other records either for the child. And then Mary Nichols, she was the first one bound out in 1760, and I'm thinking that perhaps she moved to Dalton. Dr. Perez Morton moved his family to Dalton, the area that's now Dalton, Massachusetts, in the early 1760s. And it's quite likely she went as a servant with them. But again, I couldn't find any records that would correlate to her. But I did find some interesting tangential tidbit information. Dr. Marsh didn't continue as a doctor. He actually opened up and ran a tavern and an inn. And after he died, his wife, Sarah Williams March, continued to run that inn. And in 1791, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison both stayed at that inn. So who knows? Mary Nichols could have been waiting on future presidents of the United States. We do have a bit of information, one more than other. So Elizabeth McCullough, she did complete her indenture in Massachusetts, and she married Jonathan Bagley in Hatfield in 1788. There is a Jonathan Bagley who became a founding member of the Whately Baptist Church. But that's the last record, and in the words of Henry Louis Gates in Finding Your Roots, the paper trail ran dry here. But for Thomas Banks, he remained in Hatfield, and he is a character who left a lot of rich history. And because of his history, he is often cited in the academic research about indentured servitude. So a little bit about Thomas. His father was John Banks Sr., and the Banks family at this time, you can see records where they were in and out of the almshouse in Boston. And there was a period where the father just left the children there. And it's believed that it was at that time that his first wife died. And again, he married again, rather, and with the second family. He was in and out of the almshouse with his wife and children. The children from John's Banks' first marriage included John Banks Jr., who was bound out in 1759 to Andrew Adams in Grafton, Mass. Daughter Mary was bound out, but the records don't say anymore. They just say bound out. They don't say where, they don't say to whom. Young daughter Hannah died in the almshouse. And then Thomas was bound out in 1761 to William Williams of Hatfield. So a little bit about William Williams himself. He was the upper crust. He was a member of the upper crust of Hatfield. He was the son of Colonel Israel Williams. He was a graduate of Yale, a deacon of the church, and he was a clerk of the court. And in 1763, he married Dorothy Ashley of Deerfield. Now, as the Revolutionary War approached, Israel Williams, the father, and Israel Williams Jr., as many of you know, were thrown in jail because of their Tory loyalist tendencies. And it's alleged that it was William who bailed out his father and his brother from jail. But also he tried to walk a fine line, but eventually he too lost his job as the clerk of the Common Court, of the Court of Common Pleas. So by the early 1780s, William Williams just moved his entire family to the area that became known as Dalton, which was a stronger Tory stronghold. And there he basically resurrected his career. He became a justice of the peace, and after the Revolution, he was elected to the state senate multiple times. And he was the first member of the board of trustees for Williams College. And it's there that he died in Dalton in 1808, again leaving quite an estate. So the first indenture with William Williams was to teach Thomas husbandry, but it didn't go so well. And we have a lot to thank from the reminiscences of Samuel Partridge about that. And I thought I would read an extract. He's talking about Clerk Williams, and he said, "This gentleman with his wife was on one occasion about to leave home for a few days and gave Tom particular instructions for taking care of the garden. And as they drove away, Mrs. Williams called out from the carriage, 'Tom, don't you leave a green thing in it.' On returning, they found that this last charge had been obeyed to the letter, and all trace of vegetation having disappeared from the garden. Now, I know there are some people in this audience who would have done exactly the same thing as Tom growing up. So, William Williams is about to lash young Tom, and he says to Tom, "Now, what would you do in my case?" And Tom said, "I'd give him another chance." And so he did, but apparently Tom tried William Williams once too often, because in 1770, William Williams wrote to Royal Tyler, a member of the Boston Overseers of the Poor, requesting that he be relieved of all of his contractual obligations, and that a new contract be established for young Tom with Mr. Belding in Hatfield. I've included here parts of the transcription of that letter and highlighted some important pieces. It says, "For the first 4 years, I schooled him constantly at the town school. Now he is 17 years and 3 months old and about as big as an ordinary country boy of 13 or 14 at most. I am inclined to think scarcely able to perform the service of one of our boys of that age. He never will be capable to perform the labor or endure the fatigues that are the unavoidable lot of the husbandman. I therefore attempted more than a year ago to get him a trade, but the notion which then generally, and with too much foundation in truth, prevailed of his being a rogue in grain, prevented the success of those attempts at that time." So he goes on to say, "I am by indenture bound to give him £100 when he shall arrive at 21. This I can by no means afford to do in case he leaves my service now." So young Tom now has a second indenture document with Mr. Belding as the master, and it's to be a cordwainer, which was a shoemaker at that time. What's interesting is the provision only says for 2 sets of clothes. There's no mention of any money at the end of the indenture period. There are also some document oddities. There's no first name for Mr. Belding. There are so many Beldings in Hatfield, which one is it? And I could find none who were identified as shoemakers. And then you can also see there's no dates, there's no signatures. So a question is, did this second indenture ever take place? Did it ever go into effect? And did William Williams ever get relieved of his freedom payments? Many of the academic researchers say, yes, he did. I still have my doubts, and I will try and show why later. So Tom was considered too small to do farming and husbandry, but he wasn't too small the day after the Battle of Lexington and Concord to march off with Captain Israel Chapin and the rest of the Hatfield Minutemen to Boston, where he fought at Bunker Hill. Now, there's another rumor that allegedly he was shown the white feather, which means that he was a coward and left the battlefield. I have my own theory that I would like to prove but never will be able to. I found out that Thomas's older brother John was also at the Battle of Bunker Hill, and I can just see Thomas saying, "I think I'll go visit my brother." But Thomas did fulfill 6 months of duty in 1775, which entitled him to what was then a coat or money. Smart boy took the money. Then, in 1778, there was a need for additional troops, and the selectmen of Hatfield offered a bounty to any who would volunteer to go. And Thomas did volunteer to go, and he marched to Albany in 1778. By 1780, Thomas's fighting days were over, and he married Sarah Wales of Hatfield. Good old Jonathan Lyman himself performed the ceremony. And then as you look at the census records for the periods that are shown here, it indicates that they had no children. They didn't have any hired hands as part of the household. What it does show in the 1820 census is that they owned a small home, they had land in Hatfield, and Thomas was engaged in agriculture. I didn't see any mention that he was a shoemaker of any kind. The other thing that's mentioned is that Thomas Banks' home was referred to as Banks Corner in town. Everybody knew Banks Corner. And I'm not sure, but I think that is perhaps near the intersection of Elm Street and Dwight Street today. And that is also the poorer part of the town in this time period. It's where the Wheelers were living. So it was definitely the poor part of town. There's another reason we know that Thomas was poor. In 1815, he was delinquent in paying his taxes on his land, 46 cents, which would be $10 today. This was the direct tax that was levied by the federal government, and it was trying to collect funds to pay for the wars, including the recent War of 1812. If Thomas did not pay this, he was at risk of losing his land. There's another reason we know that he was poor. This is the Hatfield voter lists from 1823. Thomas Banks' name does not appear on that voter list. In the 1780 Constitution that was written by John Adams, Samuel Adams, and James Bowdoin, they allowed white males to vote only if they had an annual income of 3 pounds or an estate worth 60 pounds. Obviously, Thomas did not have that. Neither did Daniel Shays, which also gives credence to why they were upset. They were being levied taxes to pay for a war, but they couldn't vote after the war. What you can't see because of the small print is that Israel Williams Jr., the Tory who was in jail, who didn't fight in the Revolution, he's able to vote. And then there's one last story about Thomas Banks being poor, and it's one I didn't find the academic researchers citing, but it's in the Hatfield 300th anniversary history book. And it talks about the fact that in the meeting house, people were complaining about their seats, as always. And Thomas, and the story goes, Thomas Banks, who had been assigned the poorest seat in the meeting house, stood before those who were complaining and announced, "I am thankful for a seat anywhere in the house of God." Poor but wise. And I'm sure that put a stop to the complaining in church. So Thomas died in 1826, and his wife died in 1832. And I wonder, could they be buried at Hill Cemetery, rather? I don't know. They would have been too poor to have tombstones. What I show down at the bottom is actually a document where I believe that's Thomas Banks' own handwriting, which shows he did learn to write. I find it interesting that 75 years after Thomas Banks died, they're talking about them in the book that Daniel Wells wrote of the history of Hatfield. And then 150 years later, in the centenary book, we're still talking about Thomas Banks. So he left his imprint on the town. I have one more tangential story which I'd like to share with you. And again, Daniel Wells helped me find it. Daniel Wells was in the 52nd Regiment in the Civil War, one of many from Hatfield, who were deployed on the Southern Expedition to Louisiana. One of the objectives was to gain control of the Mississippi River. And in the diary of Daniel Wells, he talks about being in New York at Camp Banks. And I said, "Where is Camp Banks?" And it turns out it's not where is Camp Banks, it is what is Camp Banks. Camp Banks was named after Nathaniel Prentice Banks, the great nephew of our Thomas Banks of Hatfield. He was the grandson of John Banks. And when I looked at this picture and I thought of what William Williams wrote about sleight of build and rogue and grain, I think that if there's any family resemblance, it's in that photo. Now, Nathaniel had to leave school. He was a Bobbin boy in Waltham, but he continued his own self-education, and he got involved in politics. He was in the state senate, and then he was in the U.S. House of Representatives for several years. And in 1857, he was governor of Massachusetts. In 1861, Abraham Lincoln appointed Banks as Major General of Volunteers. It turns out that Abraham Lincoln and Nathaniel Banks Jr. were very good friends. What's also surprising is that being appointed Major General, Nathaniel Banks was of higher rank at this time than Ulysses S. Grant. It turns out he was a better politician from what I've read than he was a general. But there is mention of him in Daniel Wells' diary, where he says, an order of thanks was read from General Banks at dress parade. He said that we had marched 300 miles in 20 days, fought in 4 battles, took 2,000 prisoners and 10 cannon. So this is a picture of Nathaniel Prentice Banks. Whether there's any resemblance to Tom, I don't know, but he continued to serve in government after the Civil War, and he died in Waltham. Now, you have all heard about Nathaniel Prentice Banks recently. Anybody remember why? Anybody remember why? You know how Kevin McCarthy was running for Speaker of the House, and there was vote after vote after vote, and they said there was only one other time in history where there were multiple votes? It was for Nathaniel Prentice Banks, where there were 133 votes before he was elected Speaker of the House. And so I can just picture Thomas thinking, way to go, cousin. And you can also see a picture of Nathaniel Banks here as a younger man. I bring this up in part because it shows that now Nathaniel Banks is of equal stature in the community as the people who were masters of his grandfather or his great-grandfather. How in 2 generations, education and hard work can bring them up so they are in, shall we say, higher echelons of society than just the servants. So just some concluding thoughts. You know, all these children were bound out to the leading citizens of town, and they were contracted in such a way that they were guaranteed housing, food, clothing, and an education or a trade, or both. And certainly the children who came from Boston had to have a better life than if they had to stay in the Charles Dickens almshouse, as I would call it. The 2 boys not bound out by the overseers of the poor, they were the craft apprentice. And if you look at their history, unlike the pauper ones, they left behind estates in their own generation. It appears that the pauper ones, through the one case of Tom Banks, took at least 1 or 2 generations. Today, the overseers of the poor don't exist, nor that indentured servitude, but the Oliver Smith apprentice program still exists, and it's sponsored by the Smith Charities. I would say that the hardest thing was not transcribing the documents, but not finding out what happened to those 7 children. But then I thought, with all our tools and technology, how many children were lost and are still lost who are separated at the border from their parents? We need to do a better job. And the other thing is that academic research shows that not being able to trace these is not uncommon. You only typically hear the really good cases or the really bad cases. So for Hatfield, Thomas Banks was the character, and so we heard about him. So maybe for all the others, they just live quiet lives. And that Hatfield and all the other towns around here was a welcoming community for them to grow up like it has been for so many other children for hundreds of years. So that is the story of the indentured servants that we've explored, and I can try and answer any questions that you might have. Thank you. Yeah.
I would just like to say thank you very much for all your work. I mean, it's very impressive what you did.
Thank you.
I thank you.
Thank you. It was my pleasure to do it. I still would like to know what happened to those children. Yes.
Was the William Williams that you spoke of, Williams father was named after him?
No, that was his cousin Ephraim Williams. But they were cousins. Yes.
Yeah, if I wanted to acquire the services and have a servant bound out to me, or whatever it's called, like, did the person who was requesting this have any options? I mean, did he get to pick which one, or did?
Nothing in the records would indicate how they were assigned a child or got to select a child. That's something that's still an open hole in the academic research. The gentleman in the back?
Thank you. That was very impressive. I wonder many things as you were going through. There were questions of to what extent was the Fugitive Slave Act similar to the powers of recovering escaped indentured servants. But also, we know in the colonial history, at least, and maybe a little bit post-colonial, that there were those in the poorhouses in England, and in London in particular, who were in effect ransomed from their prison by ship captains who would then offer them at the docks as indentured servants for 7 years. And so the ship's captain, in effect, parented the poor, not necessarily children, but those who were in prison for being poor. So linking these kinds of indentures to the other kinds of indentures, I don't know how they were regulated, who decided, was it just the ship captain had taken passengers and had the rights to sell them for 7 years? Who regulated that sort of arrival at the docks kind of indenture from this taking care of children indenture?
That, I have to be honest, I don't know the answer to that question, but there were many people who actually made it to America, made it to the colonies as indentured servants before they even left England. And I don't really know who regulated them, but I have seen similar types of ads looking for the return of those individuals separate from those who were bound out by the overseers of the poor. Kathy?
This is kind of a follow-on from Rob's question, so you may not know the answer, but I'm wondering if, like, the overseers of the poor would identify children who were in need, and then they would go to someone that they thought could take care of them and ask them, or if the wealthier families, might go to them and say, if you come across, someone, I'll take someone.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know which way it went?
I would say this is a possible answer. I read that the overseers in Boston were very aggressive about keeping metrics, not only how many they brought into the almshouse, but how many they also got out of the almshouse. So it's very possible that they did go and actively solicit people to please take these whom I brought into the almshouse. And Israel Williams, Colonel Williams, was very tightly coupled to the higher-ups in Boston. And I certainly can see that he was petitioned, and so probably he got his family members to sign up.
What you also pointed out at the beginning, with Hatfield being number 3 on the list, it does kind of make you think that there was some kind of a...
Israel Williams connection, yes. I'm sorry, I think there was another question in the back?
Whether there exist any narratives written by former indentured children. That 19th century narratives, slave narratives, or narratives about people who, in one way or another, have made their way out of difficult circumstances. Do any exist for indentured?
I honestly don't know the question in terms of these children here, but I think there are some who are craft apprenticeships who have written stories. You know, to be honest, Ben Franklin was an indentured servant as a craft apprentice. He was not a pauper apprentice. But you ask a good question. It's something that I would try and investigate to see if there are such stories. Yes, in the back.
The back corner.
Yeah.
I hadn't realized how many indentured children came from Boston. It's very interesting. Do you know there were a few cases of Hatfield children being placed with Hatfield families? Once the child had been placed, were there any opportunities for that child to see his birth family?
It's not an easy question to answer. I think in the case of Tom Banks, he never got to see his father again from what I can discern. For people who are right within the community, like Hatfield to Hatfield, yes, they could, obviously. One thing, just a totally different answer, is one of the things under the Oliver Smith will that I read was the apprenticeship program got more people or more children to participate once they allowed the child to stay in their own parents' home and not reside with the quote, master. But again, I'm not sure, did I come close to an answer for your question? Okay.
Yeah, I was just going to ask a similar question. Was it just kids from Boston that they could come out here, or were there children here in the area that could take advantage of this the program?
In terms of the craft apprenticeship, there were people outside the area that could certainly do that. I have not seen any records of overseers of the poor, for example, from Northampton, binding out a child to Hatfield. I have not seen that. Part of it is that they didn't keep records as detailed as the Boston overseers of the poor did. Yes. Yes.
A determination of one of those indentured servant contracts, the male was given $100. That sounds like it was a considerable amount of money. Is that true?
It ranged, it could vary, but yes, it was $100 or £100. The intent was that if they were trained in agriculture or husbandry, the boys could buy a farm and set up their own farm, or if they were in a trade, they could set up their own business. But remember, this was for many of them an indentured period where they had been there for 15 years. So $100 divided into 15 is, £6 or £7 a year.
So maybe it was advisable for the master to put some money away every year so that the kid
Yes.
made it.
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
I wonder if I could pursue a little bit more the caring for the poor. We know in Whately, the annual reports for the town of Whately include annually the report of for whom and by what arrangements the poor were taken care of, often by paying room and board to those who housed the poor. And so I'm wondering if there are enough records that you could say how many poor, so identified in Hatfield, were under the care of the overseers of the poor, and what fraction of the children of those were then placed in indenture rather than supported by, I suppose, town funds or what you build some other town if that was the point of origin of the family. So you spoke of lots of caring for the poor, but only a few examples of indenture. Do the numbers support that? Are there records that say how many poor families, how many children in poor families there were compared to how many indentures there were?
I have gone through a number of the annual reports that are available online for the town of Hatfield. They certainly don't go back as far as the time period we're talking about. I think the earliest one that I could find started around 1859 or so. But in each of those, it has a report from the overseers of the poor. And it talks about who they helped and how they helped. I didn't see any, and again, I didn't do all the years, where it specifically says bound out. But it'll go into, for example, housed this particular individual, provided medicine to this family for a sick child, even to paying for a funeral. So it does have that level of information, but not enough to collect metrics to say this many per year and how many children were bound out.
It sort of brings up the second question, which is what kind of oversight did the overseers provide after the first bonding out? Were there reports? Was there ever a moment where they did home visits? Do you know what I mean? Is there any trace of that in the research you did?
I read one article that said there was very little follow-up by the Boston overseers of the poor into the remote areas such as Hatfield. That they did maybe some, but not a lot, in the Boston area itself. There were some articles that did mention, though, somehow when children were there were certain cases where children were not treated well, or were not receiving education as required, and that did bubble up to some of the overseers, and they took action. But I don't have metrics, I only have anecdotes for that. Okay, yes?
Do you know if the selectmen's records exist for Hatfield? The reason I'm asking is they do exist for Deerfield. And they're full of the overseer's information.
And in terms of selectmen records, they're town meeting records from this time period, 1700s.
We actually have the memos, the selectmen kept their own records. And so every entry that would, like every letter that they wrote out, every letter that came back, all those kinds of notes, they actually exist in Deerfield, at least for the 19th century.
I can speak to that because the museum, the Hatfield Historical Museum, does have a couple different collections of records from Town Hall, records from the clerk. We do have some selectmen's reports and things, but for both your questions and yours, come and do research at your local historical society. These are really great questions, and some of these I can see, the work that Sue has done to bring this together. I love that it's firing other thoughts and other lines of inquiry, and I encourage you to do that. Thank you very, very much.